So I will be recording the webinar today, and I will be sending a copy to everyone who signed up afterward. And after the content today, we'll also have time for Q&A. And because there's so many of us and we're such a large group, we'll use the chat box for that instead of unmuting ourselves. So we have a pretty diverse interest in this webinar, and from what I can tell, there's a few people who signed up who are new to the Freshwater Alliance. So again, if you have not muted yourself, if you could do that, because we can hear some typing in the background. So for those of you who are new to the Freshwater Alliance, our mission is to build, connect, and support freshwater initiatives across Canada. So we work with NGOs, community groups, governments, and businesses to strengthen citizen voices and participation to protect our lakes, rivers, and other freshwater bodies. And we're a project on the Tides Canada shared platform. But of course, watersheds often flow across borders, so we often work with or take inspiration from groups in the United States and elsewhere. And one of the things that we do to help the freshwater community connect and learn more from each other is host webinars on about a quarterly basis every few months, where we invite guest speakers to share about freshwater projects, research, or case studies that we can draw inspiration from. So that's what we're doing today. And before I turn it over to the speakers, I just wanted to take a few minutes to talk about some of our campaigns. So in addition to doing this kind of connecting and helping to learn from each other work, Freshwater Alliance also leads a few different freshwater campaigns at the regional and national level. And one of our key campaigns is the Lake Erie Alive campaign. And I actually just recently moved to London, which I mentioned is 45 minutes away from Lake Erie. So this Lake Erie work is becoming certainly a lot more real to me now that it's my home watershed. So just before we plunge into the main content, I'm going to turn it over to our Great Lakes organizer, Raj Gill, just for a couple of minutes to give you guys a brief overview of our Lake Erie work. So Raj, do you want to just give a little intro to that?
Great, thanks, Christine. And I'll keep it brief because I know I'm pretty excited to hear from Tish and Marky, and that's sort of the main highlight here. And they'll be speaking to a lot of the content I might cover around some of the issues around Lake Erie. So I'm not going to get into that, but just I guess quickly to say that over the last several years, we at the Freshwater Alliance have been working quite a bit with various partners, both in the US and in Canada, to enhance the health of Lake Erie, particularly with regards to nutrient pollution and algae blooms. And some of this work has been done under the banner of Lake Erie Alive, working closely with Freshwater Future and Environmental Defense on really trying to raise public awareness and engagement on the issue, as well as sort of advancing and tracking government policy and on items such as like the Canada Ontario Lake Erie Action Plan. We were quite involved in commenting on that and soliciting public engagement on that, because that sort of makes a big difference in terms of movement by our local elected officials. And then now sort of tracking progress on the plan and assessing where there might be delays and what we can do to advance that. So for example, the plan was released last year. This February, there's supposed to be an action plan on implementation that hasn't been released. And so we're working together to sort of try to put the pressure on to get that moving. I think it's particularly, it's important every year. And last year we kind of lucked out with Lake Erie and the algae blooms, and it was a milder year. Forecast this year by NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, has been that it will likely be a more severe bloom due to all the rain that we've had and just loading of nutrients from the Maumee River and various other waterways into the lake. So forecast is not looking great. Most of the worst blooms have been in the last decade. And so it's trending upwards. And I kind of feel like this is not, it's not an issue that's going to go away quickly, and we really don't have a lot of time to sort of dither and sort of have inaction or slow commitments and implementation on some of the necessary actions. And I think this is why really I got pretty excited when I heard about the Lake Erie Bill of Rights effort late last year. I think it's sort of both the initial action to sort of proposal to get the bill out, I think was a great sign, but then certainly it passing was even bigger in terms of not only the citizens of Toledo, Ohio, but really capturing, I think, the sentiment across the watershed that we, if our leaders aren't going to take action, that citizens will, and this is one means to sort of, I think the message has been unequivocal in terms of citizens' desires for what might happen with the lake and where we want to see the health of the lake be and where it should go. So I'm going to leave it at that, but I think, as I said, the bill is really, I feel like, very exciting, not only in terms of indicating where citizen desire is, but also sort of looking at how we might want to, what kind of relationship we want to have with nature and with waterways, and what that might look like, and how we might redefine that in a way that is more meaningful, or certainly has hopefully implications for a healthier Lake Erie. Thanks, Christine.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Raj. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our speakers. So so I'm super excited and grateful to have Tish O'Dell and Marky Miller here with us today. So Tish is the Ohio organizer with the Community Legal Environmental Defense Fund, which is an organization that works with communities across the U.S., helping them to assert their right to self-government and the rights of nature. When I was looking at their website, it's really, really awesome. They do a lot of really amazing work, and I was quite inspired by it. So super glad to have Tish here. She's been at the CELDF since 2013. And has been working with communities in Ohio to organize rights-based initiatives. So Tish is going to start us off today. And then we'll hear from Marky Miller, who's a community organizer with Toledans for Safe Water, a grassroots citizen-led environmental group in Toledo, Ohio. So Marky was one of over 500,000 people in Toledo who lost access to clean drinking water for 3 days back in 2014, when a toxic algae bloom in Lake Erie threatened the water supply. The crisis really catalyzed her to action, and she's since become a lead organizer and spokesperson for Toledans for Safe Water. So welcome, guys. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen there, and then Tish, if you want to go ahead and share your screen and open up your presentation.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, and we can see your presentation. Perfect.
Oh, yay. I've lost my internet connection twice while you were talking, so I'm like, I hope this doesn't happen. I hope I can get through. So I don't know. Technology, when it's great, and when it doesn't, it's not so great. So if I just zone out, it's because I lost internet.
Okay, good to know. Thanks, Tish.
All right. Well, welcome everyone. And I guess I want to start by talking, you can obviously see the screen, like, is our sustainability and the rights of nature really legal, or illegal, I mean. And it's something that I think is kind of a shock for people to hear, because they really are. And I want to talk about the movement. I'm going to talk high level, like, I guess, the overall movement of rights of nature and how to build this movement in community rights. And then Marky's presentation is going to be focused more on a specific example, so you can see what I'm talking about, and then she's going to apply it to kind of like a case study to Toledo and Lake Erie. And of course, this is all based on US and Ohio law. I realize there might be some varieties and differences and variations in the Canadian legal structure and process that I'm not aware of. So let's get started here. Maybe, if I could get my screen to move. I'm not able to move to the next screen. I don't know why. Christine, do you have any idea? Oh, there we go. Okay. So what is a movement? So that's because we talk as community rights and rights of nature movement, but what really is a movement? And so looking back, obviously this is a photo from the suffrage movement, 1917. Here in the 60s, we see women marching again, right? Protesting for equal pay. 1992, marching again, this time more for the control of their bodies. And this is from more recently, 2017. And this sign really struck me, because this woman saying she's going to march so her daughter doesn't have to deal with this bullshit. Well, really? I mean, I don't know if that's really true. I think she probably is. We see the same thing in other areas. So not just women's rights, in labor issues also, right? People marched in the past. They're still marching today for equal, for living wage or increased minimum wage. Civil rights, the same thing. People marched for ending racism, integration, civil rights for everyone. We still see it today. We're still marching. And then, of course, when we get to the environmental movement, Lake Erie, this is from 1960. And of course, fighting for Lake Erie, holding up signs. 1970, we see the first Earth Day, and we also know the 70s. 72 is when the United States created the Environmental Protection Agency and put laws in place like the Clean Water Act and Clean Air Act to fix the problem. And yet this is what we're living with today in Lake Erie. So, you know, the question becomes, you know, like, what are movements, and marching and protesting are great. Yes, they can create awareness, but obviously that's not enough. So one of the problems, you know, we're looking at is focusing just on environmental here, and this is in the United States. I mean, 90% of all original forests have been cut. We have 2 trillion pounds of livestock waste discharged annually into waterways and onto land, and on and on and on. I mean, and these statistics are several years old, so they may even be, I'm sure they're higher now. Globally, we see 2/3 of all biodiversity on the planet being destroyed, and we all know about climate change acidifying the oceans, raising sea level, eliminating species, and just destroying ecosystems overall. And I mean, the latest one I read is, I think we have, what, 12 years? 12 years left if we don't make a change. So this is what we would like Lake Erie to look at in the upper left corner there. But in reality, that's what it really looks like. And in reality, why does it look like this? You know, because it's illegal for the people to prohibit corporate agriculture is one of the reasons. So why is this? This is why, you know, and Marky will get into the specifics in Toledo, but the residents there came to learn all this as they went through the process. But nature is property. So we abuse land, and this is an old quote, right? Because we regard it as a commodity belonging to us. But we need to see it as part of our community, which we belong to. And the reason I put this in, and this slide actually from Rachel Carson, her quote, because I wanted to point out that people have recognized this for a long time, and yet it just keeps getting worse and worse and worse, right? So I'm not sure exactly when she wrote this quote, but I'm assuming maybe in the 60s, but she believes that it's a basic human right, a right to a healthy environment. And she's basically saying that if the government and individuals, you know, could not even conceive, our forefathers, when they wrote our constitutions, that this would even be a problem, right? That we would actually be polluting the environment that sustains our lives. So what is the real problem? Why do we have to keep protesting the same issues over and over again? Who's solving the problems for us? Who's really protecting us in the environment? You know, aren't these laws that we've put in place supposed to do that? And what the people of Toledo realized, along with, you know, a lot of us who are involved in this work, is that really no one's protecting us. It's up to us. So one of the questions I always tell people, and, you know, ask yourselves, like, who's making these governing decisions for your community? Who's actually writing the laws? And then when you get to that point, and for whose benefit are they writing these laws? So decisions that affect you, your children, your quality of life, the future livability of your community, right there where you consider home. Is it you and the people who will be directly affected in your community, or is it someone else making these decisions for you? This is very high level. In our work with CELDEF, we have actually been, you know, we've evolved over time. We started out as a traditional law firm enforcing the environmental laws that were on the books, and over a 20-year period came up and evolved, realized what the real problem is. And this is just a very simple graphic. We go over this in our all-day democracy school in Ohio, and also there's a national democracy school that CELDEF does that's a day and a half, so we spend a lot of time on this. But just to give you a real high overview, the man in the middle there represents all of you in your community. And it kind of is this box that the structure of law has been put around us that keeps us from protecting our environment in our communities. We call it the box of allowable activism. And just to give you an example, I think everyone knows, we'll use Lake Erie as the example here. So what happened, the people passed a law, and we know it was challenged within just a short time after it was passed. And in the courts, one of the first things, the state of Ohio is actually in the case, along with a big mega agriculture corporation. And they want the Lake Erie Bill of Rights overturned. So when you go into the court case and look at the records, one of the things they're arguing why it should be overturned is that the local community, the people, don't have the authority to do this. The state is the only one that has the authority to pass laws supposedly protecting Lake Erie. We know that's obviously not true. Mark, you'll get into that a little bit more. And then when you move to the right, nature is property, back to the quote. We, in our current structure of law in our system, we look at nature as property. And when you're property, it means you're rightless. So when you think back to prior movements to expand rights for the rightless, like, for example, slaves were property of their owners. So they could not go into a courtroom and try to plead for justice or recognition of their rights because they weren't recognized within the law. Same thing with women. Before they had, had recognized rights in our legal system, they could not go to the courts because they were property of their husbands, their fathers, their brothers, and couldn't go and say, hey, judge, my husband's violating my rights. Not recognized. Well, this is the place where we find nature right now. Nature has no rights in our system. It's considered property to be used, abused, exploited by its owner for their profit and gain to do with as they want. They can even destroy it. So this is another problem we get into. And so rights of nature is changing that, saying, no, the natural environment, the environment has the right to thrive, flourish, be healthy. So that's a change we need to make, but it keeps us within this box. The bottom of the box is obviously corporate privilege and corporate rights. So what we see very evidently in the court case against the Lake Erie Bill of Rights is that farm, that huge industrial farm, is basically saying, no, our rights are being violated if the Lake Erie Bill of Rights gets to stand and the people get to enforce it on behalf of the lake. And then finally, on the left side of the box is what we call the regulatory fallacy. And a lot of people believe, this is where we get into the Clean Water Acts and things like that, and the EPAs, that they're actually protecting the lake. And what we see is, we have to really think this through, why we call it a fallacy, because when we say regulation, that means regulating the harm, which is completely different than prohibiting or stopping the harm, right? So we're slowly regulating the amount of pollution and poisons that can go into the lake, the environment. I'm going to keep using Lake Erie as the example here. So what we're living with is about 40 plus years, 4 decades of industry being permitted by the state, because, and think about that word too, they issue permits to the polluters to slowly pollute the lake. And what happens is when the Environmental Protection Agency issues that permit, it now makes the harm they're doing to the lake and to the community legal. So when a community tries to go into court there and saying, hey, they're violating the rights, or, they're polluting our water supply, the court goes and looks to see if they have a permit issued by the state, and they say, well, they do, and what they're doing is perfectly legal. And one of the other things that comes in with this regulatory fallacy is, we're told, well, part of the process of regulating is, they come up with acceptable limits of pollution. So how many picocuries of radiation did you say were okay to be put into your drinking water? You probably want 0, but there's an acceptable limit that's been determined. Same thing with, in the air we breathe, there's acceptable limits of pollution and poisons. But what people don't understand is most of those limits have been determined by the industry themselves that's being regulated. They come up with what's acceptable. So our system is basically, we then focus as environmentalists trying to enforce these regulations, and it's really what's the best we can get, not really what's the best for us and the environment, and especially the future for us and the environment. You know, this idea that nature's endless and we can continue to destroy her at a regulated pace is really catching up to us. And I mean, Lake Erie and the example in Toledo, which Mark you'll get into, really highlights that fact. You know, so we have to, sometimes we hear dilution is the solution. We hear that a lot. And it's really not, because nobody's measuring the cumulative effect of all that, right? So polluting a little here and you getting a permit to pollute a little more and another corporation getting it, it's exactly what's killing us and the environment. Reason I put this in here is because when communities then realize all this, you know, maybe they look at all those sides of the box, they've come to our school, they've lived it, they've gone to regulatory hearings, and they say, you know what, we've got to change this. And we need to propose something different, a different law. One of the first things they hear is you can't do that. It's illegal, it's unconstitutional. Well, under our current structure of law, they're correct. It is. So a movement to expand rights is about changing the laws, but it's very difficult when you're butting up against a system of law that doesn't allow you to do that. But what we need to keep in mind, slavery was legal, Holocaust was legal, right? Segregation was all legal. So the question really is, what are we going to do to make the necessary change that we need? And that's where the community rights and rights of nature strategy is. It's about the people actually challenging this current system and structure of law directly that's allowing the harm. And in the community bills of rights that we've helped draft for communities and that have been passed, like the Lake Erie Bill of Rights, it usually starts out with a rights section. So establishing, like what Rachel Carson already knew several decades ago, that we need a right to a healthy environment, that people have a right to water, the rights for the environment, that the Lake Erie has the right to thrive, flourish, and be healthy. Then what we put in is activities that should be prohibited because it violates those rights. Then we also have to redefine within these laws corporate powers of corporations and what their rights.
Uh-oh. It looks like Tish has frozen. So she warned me that her internet was going out a little bit. So maybe in the meantime, while Tish kind of reboots and comes back, Marky, do you think it would be okay if we turn it over to you to talk a little bit specifically about the Lake Erie Bill of Rights? Sorry, Marky, you were muted, so I just unmuted you there.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I can take over while she gets restarted here.
Awesome. Okay, cool. So you should be able to share your screen.
Okay, so hopefully you can see my screen on here. Yeah, sorry about that. Hopefully Tish can join us again. My name is Marky Miller, and I'm one of the organizers behind the Lake Erie Bill of Rights here in Toledo. And just going to do, hoping to apply some of those topics that Tish was going over about community rights, rights of nature, and give you a preview of the challenges that we went through and just the process that we had here on the ground. So obviously, the 2014 water crisis was the catalyst for the Lake Erie Bill of Rights and for a majority of the water activism that kind of cropped up in that time. I like this graphic. This is a satellite image from August of 2014, and it's not the most menacing looking bloom we've ever had. It certainly was not the most toxic, but this image is great because it shows you where the water intake well is as well. And what we were hearing a lot of in the very beginning was, you know, this is not a crisis, this was just a situation, and the wind drifted the bloom into our intake well, so you really don't need to worry about it, which obviously we did worry about it because we had no drinking water for 3 days. And the foundation of the Lake Erie Bill of Rights was saying it's great that this issue came to our tap water, that it made its way to our kitchen sink, but what's going on with the ecosystem as a whole? And are we really protecting that, or are we just treating the symptoms of a problem that we're not even paying attention to? I've lived in this area my whole life, and I can't recall a time where we were talking about harmful algae season is approaching. And that's the tone that my community has taken now, is every summer when it starts to heat up, we talk about prevention. We talk about, are you prepared for algae season? It was never something that we talked about previously. This was the first notification that went out for the water crisis, August 2nd at 1:21 in the morning. So not a time when a lot of people were online, when they were looking for this kind of information. If you woke up and the first thing you did was not go to Facebook or check your phone, you most likely went and took your shower, brushed your teeth, made coffee, whatever your routine was. So I just wanted to put this in here to show kind of how that initial shock of seeing this, that you can't make baby formula, you can't prepare food, you shouldn't give any water to your pets, brushing your teeth, making ice. I mean, everything was off limits when this started. We weren't able to boil the water, and we're just learning for the first time about cyanobacteria and microcystin and what those toxins were, and that really showing that we weren't prepared for this. And let's point out too that information became just as valuable as water. This was not a widespread message until well into the first day. There are people in my community who don't have unlimited access to the internet. So it was a lot of knocking on doors, trying to get the word out, making sure we had schools prepared, nursing homes, income or lower income communities who maybe didn't have the same resources that other people had. So we were all affected by this, but it was not equally distributed in terms of how people were affected. It was 3 days of panic, of showing how vulnerable we really were. If you didn't have transportation, you were lined up in one of these long lines waiting to get a ration of water. And if you didn't have transportation, you also had to then walk it back to wherever you had to go. And keep in mind, it's August, it's very hot. People were waiting in line for hours. Every time they run out of water, they'd have to come and bring more. The grocery stores were depleted, and not just of bottled water, but all the fresh produce had to be thrown away. Disposable paper products, paper plates, napkins, plastic utensils, all of those were gone. People were stocking up frozen foods, anything that didn't require washing or didn't require water. And then your home started to look like an emergency bunker because you were stocking up. And we didn't know, would this be over by the end of the day? Would it last all week? Was it going to happen again? So that uncertainty caused a lot of fear and a lot of mistrust in our community, in our water system, in our government. We had really not a lot of information of what was going on. So, your first instinct is to try and get involved, try and get answers. And this image is from 2017, so part of the years that followed. But speaking from my own personal experience, when I think it was day 2 or 3 of the water crisis, I went to a town hall meeting where we were not allowed to ask what happened. We were not allowed to comment on what caused the bloom. We were told to only look forward. It's hard to look forward when you don't really know where you've been. So there was a lot of censorship going on in these formal discussions. People weren't allowed to be heard. And the community picked up on that right away and started saying, what are you hiding? And if you're not going to talk about this, then you're not protecting the people, you're not protecting the lake, you're protecting something else. Whether that's the corporate rights or whatever is behind this problem, there was something that was preventing us from getting that information. And people were getting more riled up about it, and it was actually causing some distance between our access to our public officials and, for the community, where we had Facebook town halls where you had to send your questions in advance and you weren't allowed to be heard. And the rhetoric was, don't worry, we're prepared, we're going to warn you really early. You can see in the background of this slide, there's the little meter where they tell you how safe your water is. Their answer was, this is how much we've spent on chlorine this year, and this is how many gallons we have ready to go. So that was this very reaction-based approach that our city was taking, and people were really afraid of that. So we started forming our own groups. This is actually an image of another group here, Advocates for Clean Lake Erie, who their initial response was really to turn up the heat and put a lot of pressure on local officials, on state officials, on the regulatory agency. They did and continue to do a wonderful job at asking the questions they're not allowed to ask. And when people squirm and don't want to give them those answers, they go out and find it and they present it to the public. So groups like this really helped get more people involved and engaged in this process, because it turned out that just because they tell you no doesn't mean you're not free to go out and continue to do those things on your own. Really, the lack of response, the inaction from the state, from our local government, from the EPA, really inspired people to really step up. So you go through this process and you have this realization, as Tish was touching on briefly, that we're just permitting the problem, we're regulating the problem, and we're saying you are allowed to poison us at this rate. And I know recently there was a report that came out from the Environmental Working Group and the Environmental Law and Policy Center about just looking at the Maumee watershed alone, 40% of the industrialized agricultural operations in that watershed are not permitted, are not regulated. And kind of come to this conclusion that we need that. We need better regulations, right? And to me, looking at the source of what's causing this problem, it's not just that we have an excess of bioavailable dissolved phosphorus in our watershed. It's also that we have environmental laws now that no longer protect us, that no longer protect our community and our environment. That just because you are a few animals under the limit doesn't mean you're doing any less harm. So the realization that no one's coming to save us can seem really scary at first, but it also was a very empowering moment for my community to realize that if you won't do it, we will. And we're going to make the laws that we want to live by. We're not going to sit back and accept being harmed, accept that our Lake Erie is going to be used as essentially a free regional toilet for industrialized agriculture. And you can look at any problem that you're facing, whether it's pipelines or radioactive de-icer, anything like that, and it comes down to, well, what does the law say? And getting to those regulations and getting to that this is totally legal, this is totally fine, it's okay, it's under the watchful eye of these agencies over here. And the community rights approach starts to say that maybe we don't want to accept that we just have to allow these things to happen, that we have to be part of the harm, and that we have to wait for something bad to happen before then you have to come in and clean it up, right? And it's kind of this risk that maybe with a pipeline, it's not if it will leak, but when. And you're not allowed to say we don't want that because the risk is too great to this community. So we decided here as Toledoans and as Toledoans for Safe Water, that we were going to try and form a new structure of government, a new structure of law that says not only do we as people have an inalienable right to exist and flourish, but also the environments, the communities that sustain us, those need to be equally protected as well. So the Lake Erie Bill of Rights is the first in the nation rights of nature law that is specific to an ecosystem. In 2006, Tamaqua, Pennsylvania passed a local ordinance that included rights of nature. So that's officially the first one in the country. But we're the first that has it specific to a body of water, specific to an ecosystem. So what we wanted was laws that reflect what we value, laws that keep our communities healthy and sustained, that promote justice. We started to collaborate early on with CELDA, the organization Tish is with, and said, this is what we want, this is what we want to see. Can you help us put that into a legal document? You know, help us amend our city charter so that we can make this into a law. And she's exactly right in saying that these things are seen as unconstitutional, they're seen as illegal, and you have to keep pushing them forward no matter how daunting and challenging and impossible that they seem, because all of those pushes forward are direct confrontations to laws that we find unjust, to laws that are actually oppressing us and making it so that we aren't able to have clean water, clean air, clean soil. And, you know, we look at landmark cases or historic speeches and say, well, that was the biggest turning point for that movement. But to get to that point, to have that pivotal change, you have to build on it. So I know that Lake Erie Bill of Rights opened some doors and hopefully have created opportunities for communities down the road. But we certainly wouldn't have been able to do that if the stage hadn't been set by other communities throughout Ohio who have been working on community rights laws and rights of nature laws and continuously kept off the ballot or challenged or had their laws revoked immediately after being passed. So you start to build on that, and the more you do it, the more you chip away at those barriers and start exposing the system for what it is. So we are just a group of volunteers. We're mostly younger activists, so we all have full-time jobs. Some of us have small children at home. We have some members who are still students in school. So we all have a lot of other obligations and responsibilities going on. And in our free time, got together to collect 10,500 signatures. It did take us about 2 years to do that. We have probably 10 core organizers and then maybe 40 volunteers who would come and go whenever they had time. And you had any people who collect anything from 1 signature to 400 signatures. One of our organizing members collected 1,600 on his own. So it was just whatever time you had on the evenings and the weekends to go out, talk to your neighbors, talk to, I guess we really didn't go to our elected officials because we had seen their inaction for so many years that we just wanted to take this straight to the people. But you go out there, you make those connections and just start talking. It was definitely a grind. If you've ever petitioned before, you know, if not, then it's definitely a lot of hard work. And real quickly, just to give you a sense of our timeline, when we submitted these in August of 2018, we were on track to be on the November 2018 ballot. We had lots of issues just getting an answer from our city saying how many signatures we need. They went back and forth. They wouldn't tell us. We had to turn them in without knowing exactly how many we needed, which is why we tried to get double of what we thought was the valid amount. We were immediately blocked by our local board of elections, which is an appointed body, 2 Republicans, 2 Democrats. They are not elected by the people. They are appointed by their political parties and kind of take their cue from the Secretary of State. And we took them to the Supreme Court, the Ohio Supreme Court, right away. At the time, there was another initiative called Keep the Jail Downtown that was also seeking to be on the ballot, and they had been inspired by what we were doing, so they used our petition as a template to carry that forward. And I think they kind of got caught in the crosshairs with us, that the language was so similar that they kept both initiatives off. While we were waiting for a decision, we had several lobbyist groups, which I have written down at the bottom here, file an amicus brief against us, stating why they felt there should not be a Lake Erie Bill of Rights, why we should not be allowed to put this on the ballot, to put this to the people. Some pretty powerful players down here: the American Petroleum Institute, Ohio Port Council, Farm Bureau, Chamber of Commerce. I mean, we had some pretty powerful enemies straight away. Got their attention. When the ruling came back at the end of September, we had lost our case, but not because of any decision based on the merits of our law or what was happening in terms of, are we allowed to do this or not. The Supreme Court actually came back and said, there's been a mistake. We made an error. We have different opinions going on, where sometimes we say it's okay for the Board of Elections to keep something off the ballot. Sometimes we rule that it's not. And they saw that there was a discrepancy there. So even though we lost, it was kind of a win in a way, because we saw that this doubt was starting, the chaos was starting. And by putting these through to the Supreme Court, by bringing these challenges up, creating these confrontations, we're starting to force them to reevaluate what people want versus what our laws dictate. So even though we lost, it was hard. We tried to make that into as much of a win as we could. A couple weeks later, the jail initiative went to the Ohio Supreme Court, and they came back. They also lost, but they had said, we've made a decision now, and it is not okay for a Board of Elections to keep something off the ballot based on content. You're not allowed to do that. You strictly play an administrative role. And they overturned the precedent that was used against our case in keeping us off. So that was wonderful. Now, the reason that both initiatives still lost in the Ohio Supreme Court was because they felt there was a discrepancy with our charter amendment, our local charter, in saying not only do you have to get signatures, but you also have to get a resolution from your city council. So both groups went back to city council, said, the people want this. They collected the signatures. We did everything. You need to please pass this resolution so that we can move on to the ballot. Well, the jail got on right away and set up the special election for February of 2019. We took a little more convincing and actually got to the point, you can see this photo here, where we were standing in city council chambers and had tape over our mouths that said, let us vote. And we just stood there. We were called buffoons. We were told we were setting a bad example, that we needed to respect the decorum of their body, of the city council, of the building itself. And what we were doing was completely inappropriate. All we wanted was our right to vote. So, these protests kept happening until we were heard. And then finally, on December 4th, we were approved by City Council to go to the ballot, which means you have to go back to the Board of Elections, where a protester, just a member of the community, Democrat, union worker, kayaker, his name was Josh Abernathy, filed a protest against us and was represented by a law firm that we were quite familiar with, because they had represented oil and gas in other communities throughout Ohio up against similar Bill of Rights type initiatives. So then we saw them again here in Toledo representing this gentleman. 10 days later, we had to have a hearing. And we won. We won that hearing by the Board of Elections. And I just wanted to point out this quote at the bottom, where he says, he being Josh Hughes, one of our Board of Election members, Democrat, that it pained him to make this motion to put the Lake Erie Bill of Rights on the ballot, that it's unconstitutional, and he sure hopes it gets challenged. That was the mentality that we were up against from our government, you know, and obviously we weren't going to be deterred by that. So when you look at just looking at his quote about it being unconstitutional, the obedience to unjust laws, you know, what we would deem unconstitutional today versus back then, those things change, right? Our social norms change, our perspectives change. When I look at this picture of the protest at the Woolworth lunch counter against segregation, what we feel now when we look at this photo was very different from when it was first taken. So, you know, sure, maybe it's unconstitutional, but laws are meant to change. And this is just people asking for their democratic right to vote on a change. Abernathy did take the Board of Elections to the Supreme Court. He lost. We were confirmed for the ballot January 23rd, giving us 1 month to campaign. And winning that election was this overwhelming moment, because this whole time we're being told no, 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 no by people of high authority, by regulatory agencies, by the people that we voted for, that we have at one point had some kind of respect for. And when we put the question to the people, they say yes. So that was a really profound moment for all of us to not only fight so hard for our right to vote, but to hear a resounding yes from the people in our community. Now, post-election, the very next day, there was a 30-page lawsuit filed by Dravis Farm Partnership, LLC. They claim to be a family farm. They have 7,000 acres across 3 different counties here in Ohio. They are owned by a family, so that's fair to say. And they are suing the city of Toledo. We tried to intervene as the citizen group that put this forward. We also made a motion to intervene as Lake Erie, and both of those were denied. The state of Ohio, however, made a motion to intervene against us as a plaintiff, claiming that they are proprietor and trust of the waters, and that basically Libor is negligent against the privilege of engaging in lawful operations for corporations. So, you know, we're still fighting this fight. And more recently, we had a state budget bill passed that at the last minute slipped in a provision, basically trying to nullify any future rights of nature law or bill or amendment, anything, whatever your chartered city or not lives in. So, you know, we're still obviously fighting this. We're not deterred by this budget bill. We're not deterred by anybody seeking to destroy rights of nature. It makes us want to push even harder, if anything. And I go through all of this not to say it's scary and it's difficult and don't do it, but to say that all we are asking is to hold polluters accountable for the waste that they produce, for the harm that they inflict on these communities, on our ecosystems. And that if we had given up that first time when we were told, no, you can't be on the ballot, we would have had a very different story to tell. You know, we would have had to have given up. So the power of civic engagement, the power of civil disobedience, and pushing forward, even though you're told that you don't have a right to do that. You know, I hope that we see this keep spreading, and I hope that the spirit of the Lake Erie Bill of Rights can continue to other Great Lakes, to other shorelines, to other borders. You know, because we're certainly not deterred at all by anybody telling us we can't do that. I think that's it for my presentation. Sorry, I think I went a little bit over. I don't know if Tish is back. Maybe she can.
Yep. Yes, I'm back. I heard you, Marky. Yeah, I apologize for that. I somehow lost internet, and I basically just wanted to, you know, say to Mark, you know, add to that end. The last part of my presentation was going to be just that Toledo led by example, and no matter what happens, even if it's overturned, that other people need to join in and do it anyway, because that's what the civil disobedience part is. When Rosa Parks sat in that seat, those kids at the lunch counter, that didn't end it. More people started doing it. So I'll just end with that.
Awesome. Thank you so much, guys. And so much respect to you, Marky, and your co-organizers for continuing to get up and keep going in the face of all of that opposition. I'm sure it's not easy, but yeah, it's really, really amazing and great work. So we don't have a ton of time. We're officially scheduled till 2. If we run a few minutes over, I'm sure that's okay. But so there are some questions that are coming in. And if you do have questions in the chat, please just go ahead and put those into the chat box. And I will try to get to as many as possible in the next few minutes. So a lot of applause, a lot of good job, amazing vision. Can we get the contact info for speakers up on the screen again? Are you guys okay with me sharing that information, or your contact?
I think Marky's last slide, you have that.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
I can do that.
Yeah.
Okay. Cool. I can also share it in a follow-up email as well. I know they're very busy, and obviously, as you heard, a lot of opposition and things coming up. I'm wondering, where are you guys getting the funding to have all these legal battles? And lawyers aren't cheap. How are you doing it through fundraising, or is it the CDELF, is it that's supporting you, or how are you guys kind of able to do that work?
I was going to say,
I don't know, Tish, if you want to take it.
Okay, I was just going to check the CELDA, Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund, is a public nonprofit interest, or a public interest law firm, and we are funded by foundations, donations, things like that, and then we provide low cost or free legal services to the community. So we've been helping the Toledoans for safe water with this, but they have also raised money. We did a crowd justice, online campaign. So a lot of different places.
And we raised money for our own campaign. We actually spent just under $6,000 on our campaign, and that was all donations from just people in the community, or donations that brought in online or at meetings. We had a campaign that the opposition opposed us. They spent over $300,000 to derail our initiative. So it was kind of rewarding to win that. They did this under the name Toledo Jobs and Growth Coalition. And once we got a hold of the campaign finance reports, found that it was 99% funded by BP. So we had the oil and gas industry trying to fund this very expensive campaign against our tiny self-funded $5,000 initiative.
Yeah, what I didn't get to at the end of my presentation is that this is really about power shift, right? Who gets to make these decisions? And so, of course, the ones with the power are going to fight this all the way, right? They don't want to everything's working perfectly and fine for the polluters right now. And, our government is protecting the polluters, so they don't want it to change. So, of course, they're going to come out. And that's why the Toledo story is so great, too. It's a David versus Goliath type story, because what you hear from people is, oh, my God, this is too hard. We can't do this. We'll never win. They're too big. But, that's where we look at a real movement for change versus a moment. I mean, all the movements face these same obstacles, right? The slaves didn't have big bank accounts behind them. Women sure didn't have a bank account, and they couldn't invite or elect new people to protect them because they couldn't vote. So, it's always been this way when we're talking about movements for change. So don't give up.
Yeah, that's pretty impressive. 5,000 versus 300,000. Another question about, so did you face opposition from people within the community? And maybe I would add to that, kind of on the flip side, what kind of, how were you able to build support? What were your kind of key tactics to, reaching new audiences, new people, getting people involved and excited?
Yeah, well, I mean, the water crisis certainly helped, because everyone was aware of that, right? It's hard to ignore that happening. and being so limited in our time, like I said, most of our organizers are in their 20s and 30s and juggling all kinds of different responsibilities and obligations. We really put our work into social media. It was free, it was available to us. And then when we were out at the polls, we were talking to voters going in, and largely it was older voters who I thought, oh, we didn't really get to put in a lot of one-on-one time with people who weren't plugged into our media. And they said, I remember in the 60s, in the 70s, I remember having this fight all, and I'm heartbroken to see it happening. And my children and my grandchildren, they told me about this initiative. They talked to me about it. So we had a lot of growing support from the fact that people in this community have been through this once already, and they saw the inaction, they saw the resistance. It was easy to expose the corporate rights and those privileges being played out against our own. So people were paying attention to that. They were pretty plugged in. As far as opposition goes within the community, we didn't have much. I mean, we had people who were skeptical of rights of nature, but did not see an alternative being introduced to them either. There were a fair few union groups locally that tried to paint us as this job-killing, extreme group. But that was really coming from a lot of the leadership and not necessarily from the membership. So it varied pretty widely in terms of what people were experiencing.
That's usually the main obstacle, right? Economics. That's what they use. That if you do this, it's going to kill jobs. It's going to cost, the economic feasibility of the community. Or in this case, they had that water crisis, and a lot of the restaurants, the businesses had to shut down. They were affected by it too. No one can live without clean water. I mean, and they experienced that. So that argument didn't play so well in Toledo.
Right. Right. I know I got sent home from work during the water crisis, so all of my hours were cut. And when you're working part-time and rely on the hours you're given, you felt that. So it's not like you could make a case that we were going to be doing any more damage than losing our water already did.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's definitely a strategy that we see a lot. Another campaign that the Freshwater Alliance is working on is there's new environmental legislation that's been brought in to basically make the Environmental Assessment Act a little bit more rigorous. And there's been a huge campaign against, mostly led by the oil and gas industry, and, jobs is the thing that they're saying. But, at the same time, there's wildfires burning out of control in the province where a lot of that opposition is coming from. So definitely, threatening people's livelihoods. The irony is pretty bare.
And not only that, I always ask people, why do we have to make that choice?
Exactly.
Why choose between a job and clean water?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So a couple questions here about whether or not there is any collaboration with local Indigenous communities bringing about this Rights of Nature bill at all.
We would love to do that. We're exploring that more now and trying to make those connections. It's been difficult just making that initial contact though, and it comes down to mostly the time that we had. When we started campaigning, we had less than a month to really put things together. So it was about just getting the word out. Now is a great time for us to continue doing that. So our group was invited to speak at the United Nations this last April, and we made some connections with the Ho-Chunk Nation in Wisconsin. And so I'm working with people from that group to help maybe solidify some of those contacts and make sure that moving forward we do have more of that.
Yeah, we would love to have communities along the Lake Erie shoreline, join into this so that it's not just a single community, that it's lots of kids. I mean, when you think about that, I mean, those are the kind of like nice dreams I have about the future, that they will all be, you know, proposing Lake Erie bills of rights that all live along, and then maybe Lake Michigan and Lake Superior, and they all do. And then that's how that movement builds upward again. I don't know if I got that to on my slide presentation, but those movements start grassroots and push up, but they always focus us to go to the top first, because that's so easily controlled by the corporate and all that. So no movement for change has ever started at the top and trickled down to expand rights.
Mm-hmm. We have Paul Baines here that's just saying that Ho-Chunk Nation is also pushing for legal rights of nature around wild rice related harvesting. So yeah, I'm not, I don't have a ton more information there, but just, I guess.
They passed that. The Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund, you know, was involved there too.
Oh, cool.
And they did pass that. Mm-hmm.
Awesome. Cool. All right. So maybe time for one more question, because we're a little over time here. We have Therese is asking what's happened to the lake censure campaign. I mean, I guess this was only, this only happened in February of this year. So probably hasn't, you know, not a ton yet, but her question is what's happened to the lake censure campaign? Have industrial operations had to make changes? Is the water being remediated? I mean, yeah, only a few months, but if you have any comments on that.
No, I can't say anybody's taken any steps. In fact, last week there was a new law from the US EPA saying that agriculture no longer has to report, you know, any pollution from animal waste. So I would argue that the opposite is actually happening now. And we've had an absurd amount of rain in the last couple of months, and this is the time now when the rain is going to tell us what kind of bloom we can expect later this summer and probably later into the fall too. So there's been a lot of gearing up for algae season, and forecasts that keep getting updated because the rain has been just almost daily. So everyone's being very watchful. People are talking about what the bloom's going to look like this year, and you can feel a lot of tension about it. But in terms of any progress, you know, there's the governor's H2 Ohio plan that's being discussed, but that's, again, just more money being thrown at the problem and really not addressing stopping it at the.
Yeah, and I would just venture too about the kind of, now you're a little, you know, in the reaction phase, and I think every single time there's social progress made, we always see pushback. You know, it's never linear, right? We get things and then it goes back and then a little farther. So, I mean, I think that pushback is to be expected, but it also means that you're doing good work.
Well, I was going to say, just to add to that, this is about changing culture as well as it is about changing law. And that's what the Lake Erie Bill of Rights really did. I started this work, like you said, back in 2012 in my community. And when we had rights of nature just included in, it wasn't anything specific in ecosystem, but just giving nature rights, I would get, you know, such pushback from like, what are you going to do? Put a squirrel on the witness stand, you know, things like that. And so it's interesting to me, in just 5 short years, when the Toledo went past their Lake Erie Bill of Rights, people aren't saying that. They're going, well, yeah, that makes total sense. They're saying, you know, of course, if corporations have rights, then of course nature should have rights. So it didn't really take that long for that shift to happen. And so we need to push that further.
Absolutely. Great. Well, just one quick question about, could we read the Bill of Rights somewhere? Like, is it possible to access the actual verbiage that people voted on?
Yes, on our website, lakeerieaction.org, we do have the full language written out there.
Perfect. Great. Well, maybe I'll end it there because we're 7 minutes over. So I just want to say thank you so much to Tish and to Marky and to everyone that was able to join us today. Really fantastic webinar. And yeah, and I will send out a recording of the webinar today that you are free to share, and you can look up the Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund and Toledans for Safe Water on social media. Like them, follow them. And yeah, thank you so much for your great work, guys. And thanks again.
Thanks for having us.
Okay, take care. Bye.